The letter arrived on a Thursday morning in March, delivered with the rest of the household correspondence on a silver salver that had been in the Ashford family for 3 generations. It was addressed to His Grace, the Duke of Ashford, in a hand that was not the crisp, angular script of his solicitor or the careful copperplate of his steward, but something else entirely. Looping, feminine, familiar in a way that made Caroline Ashford's hand pause for the briefest moment as she sorted through the morning's delivery in her private sitting room. She held the letter up to the light. The paper was expensive, but not as expensive as the stationery used by the families who moved in their circle. The seal was unstamped wax, pressed with what looked like the edge of a signet ring that had left only a partial impression, as though the sender had either been careless or deliberate in their anonymity. Caroline set it aside. She finished sorting the rest of the correspondence: invitations to dine, a note from the vicar about the Easter arrangements, a bill from the wine merchant that she would review with the housekeeper later. And then she picked up the unfamiliar letter again. She did not open it. That would be unconscionable. But she held it for a long moment, feeling the weight of it, and something in the precise quality of her stillness suggested that Caroline Ashford, Duchess of Ashford for 7 years and mistress of Thornfield House for all of them, already knew exactly what this letter contained. She placed it on the breakfast tray that would be carried down to the dining room at 8:30, as it was every morning. She placed it directly beside where the Duke's plate would be set. And then she went downstairs to eat her eggs. The marriage of Caroline Fairfax and Henry Ashford, 6th Duke of Ashford, had been a transaction disguised as a romance, which was to say it had been entirely ordinary for their class and their time. Caroline had been 22, the second daughter of an earl with more lineage than liquidity, raised to be ornamental, accomplished, and entirely prepared for the specific kind of loneliness that came with marrying a man who needed a wife more than he wanted a companion. Henry had been 29, newly inherited after his father's sudden death, in possession of 4 estates, considerable parliamentary influence, and the kind of face that made mothers push their daughters forward at balls with the strategic force of generals deploying cavalry. He had needed to marry. She had needed to marry. They had danced twice at Lady Pemberton's ball, spoken 3 times over the course of the season, and been engaged by June. The wedding had been in September. It had rained. Caroline's mother had cried through the ceremony, not from sentiment but from relief that her difficult second daughter, too tall, too serious, too prone to reading books that had nothing to do with watercolors or the pianoforte, had secured a duke. Caroline had stood at the altar in her mother's veil and her grandmother's pearls and made promises she had intended to keep. Henry had made the same promises. He had meant them at the time. Men like Henry Ashford always meant their promises at the time. It was the keeping of them that proved difficult. The first 3 years had been, by any reasonable measure, adequate. Henry was not cruel. He was not a gambler or a drunk or a man who raised his voice or his hand. He was simply absent. He spent his mornings in his study managing estates, and his afternoons in Parliament managing votes, and his evenings in his club managing the kind of masculine camaraderie that did not translate into anything resembling intimacy when he returned home at midnight and found his wife still awake with a book. They had separate bedrooms, which was expected. They dined together when his schedule permitted, which was less often than etiquette suggested was appropriate, but more often than some of Caroline's married friends saw their own husbands. They attended the necessary social functions as a pair. They performed their roles with competence, and if Caroline sometimes felt like a piece of well-maintained furniture, valued for her function, admired for her appearance, but not particularly noticed unless she was absent or broken, she told herself that this was simply what marriage was. That affection, if it came at all, came later. That she was lucky to have a husband who did not make her life actively difficult. That wanting more than adequate was the kind of greedy discontent her mother had warned her against during the engagement. The 4th year, something shifted. Henry began staying later at his club. He began taking trips to London that lasted 3 days instead of 1. He began looking at Caroline across the dinner table with a distracted politeness that suggested he was calculating something in his head that had nothing to do with her. And then, in the 5th year, Caroline met her. Lady Isabel Crane was a widow, young, beautiful, and in possession of the kind of vivid, restless charm that made every room she entered feel smaller and more interesting simultaneously. Her husband, a cavalry officer, had died at Waterloo, leaving her with a comfortable income, a house in Mayfair, and no particular interest in remarrying when she could instead move through London society as an independent woman with just enough scandal attached to her name to make her compelling. Caroline had been introduced to her at a musicale. Isabel had smiled with warm, genuine interest and said that she had heard so much about the Duchess of Ashford's work with the tenants' school, and wasn't it marvelous that someone of her position cared about such things. They had spoken for 20 minutes about education and estate management and the particular difficulties of convincing tenant farmers that sending their daughters to school was not a waste of time. It had been the most interesting conversation Caroline had had in months. She had liked Isabel immediately. She had liked her right up until the moment, 6 weeks later, when she walked into the library at Thornfield House and found Henry standing too close to Isabel near the window, his hand at the small of her back, his head bent toward hers in a way that was not the posture of a man discussing the weather. Caroline had stopped in the doorway. They had not seen her. She had watched for approximately 4 seconds, long enough to see Henry's hand move from Isabel's back to her waist, long enough to see Isabel laugh quietly and place her hand over his, long enough to understand with perfect, awful clarity what had been happening during those 3-day trips to London. And then she had stepped back into the hallway and closed the door without a sound. She had gone upstairs to her sitting room. She had sat in the chair by the window, and she had made a decision. The decision was this. Caroline would not confront Henry. She would not weep or rage or create a scene that would force him to choose between his wife and his mistress in a way that would humiliate them all. She would not write to her mother or her sister or dissolve into the kind of hysterical feminine despair that confirmed every assumption about women being too emotional for the serious business of managing their own lives. She would do what she had been doing for 5 years. She would manage. She would manage the house. She would manage the estates when Henry was too distracted to do so himself. She would manage the social calendar and the tenant relations and the accounts and the staff and every other invisible piece of architecture that kept Thornfield running so smoothly that Henry never once had to think about how it was done. And she would manage herself. She would observe, she would document, and she would wait. Because men like Henry Ashford always, eventually, made mistakes. And Caroline Fairfax Ashford had been raised by a father who taught her that the key to winning any negotiation was having better information than the other party and knowing exactly when to deploy it. She began to pay attention, not obsessively, not in a way that consumed her or turned her bitter. Simply with the cool, methodical focus she had once applied to the study of household management and estate law, which her father had taught her, because he believed his daughters should understand the financial mechanics of the lives they would be expected to maintain. She noticed that Henry's trips to London followed a pattern, every 3rd week, departing on Tuesday, returning on Thursday. She noticed that Isabel Crane attended the same events as the Ashfords with increasing frequency, and that Henry's attention during those events was divided in a way that was just subtle enough that most people would not notice, but not subtle enough to escape someone who was looking. She noticed that the household expenditure had increased slightly over the past 6 months in ways that suggested Henry was purchasing gifts, nothing extravagant enough to appear in the formal accounts, but small, thoughtful things that required ready cash and did not leave receipts. She did not mention any of this. She simply continued to be an exemplary duchess. She managed the spring planting schedules. She organized the harvest festival. She visited the tenants and listened to their concerns and resolved disputes with the kind of patient, practical intelligence that made people trust her. She answered correspondence. She planned menus. She oversaw the hiring of a new undergardener and the dismissal of a footman who had been stealing wine from the cellar. She did all of this with the same competence she had always brought to her role, and if the staff noticed that her grace had become even more precise, even more focused, even more quietly, ruthlessly capable, they attributed it to her natural disposition and thought nothing of it. The letter, when it arrived that Thursday morning in March, was not a surprise. Caroline had been expecting something like it for weeks. Affairs of this nature always generated correspondence, and correspondence, if one was patient, eventually made its way into the wrong hands or the right ones, depending on one's perspective. She did not open the letter. She did not need to. She knew what it would say because she had observed enough of Henry and Isabel's interactions to predict it with reasonable accuracy. It would be affectionate. It would reference things they had done together, places they had been, promises they had made. It would be written in the particular language of two people who believed themselves to be conducting their intimacy in private and who had not yet realized that privacy, in households staffed by 15 people, was a polite fiction. Caroline placed the letter on the breakfast tray. She placed it where Henry would see it immediately. And then she went downstairs and took her seat at the breakfast table, where her soft-boiled eggs and toast were waiting, and opened the morning newspaper to the page discussing the proposed amendments to the Corn Laws, which she had been following with interest. Henry arrived at the breakfast table at 8:30, as he did every morning. He was already dressed for the day. Dark coat, perfectly knotted cravat, the slight distraction in his eyes that suggested he was mentally reviewing the list of things that required his attention before he departed for London later that morning. He sat down. He unfolded his napkin. He reached for the coffee pot. And then he saw the letter. Caroline watched him over the top of her newspaper. She watched his hand pause. She watched his eyes focus on the handwriting. She watched the color drain from his face in the particular way that happens when a man realizes he has been caught in something he believed was secret. He did not pick up the letter immediately. He looked at it for a long moment, and then he looked at Caroline. She turned a page of the newspaper. She did not look up. Henry cleared his throat. Caroline. Yes? She kept her eyes on the article about the Corn Laws. Her voice was perfectly level, politely attentive, the voice of a woman who had been asked to pass the marmalade. This letter arrived with the Morning Post, she said. I placed it on your tray. She turned another page. I assumed it was something that required your attention. A silence, the kind of silence that has weight and texture and fills a room more completely than sound. Caroline cut into her egg with surgical precision. The yolk ran gold across the white plate. She dipped a corner of toast into it and took a small, deliberate bite. Henry picked up the letter. His hands were not entirely steady. He broke the seal. He read. Caroline continued eating her eggs. She had perfected the art over the past 2 years of appearing entirely absorbed in whatever task was before her while remaining acutely aware of everything happening in her peripheral vision. She did not need to watch Henry directly to know that his jaw had tightened, that his breathing had changed, that he was reading something that was making him understand, with growing horror, exactly how exposed he had just become. The letter was from Isabel. Caroline had known it would be. What she had not known, because she had not opened it, was exactly what it said. But she could infer from Henry's reaction that it was not a casual note. It was intimate. It was specific. It was the kind of letter that, if read by the wrong person, would be devastating. Henry set the letter down beside his plate. He did not fold it. He simply placed it there, as though he could not quite bring himself to touch it any longer than necessary. He looked at Caroline. She was eating toast. You read this, he said. It was not quite a question, not quite an accusation, something in between. I did not, Caroline said. She set down her toast and finally looked at him directly. Her eyes were calm. I am many things, Henry, but I'm not in the habit of opening correspondence addressed to other people. That would be a breach of trust. The irony of the statement landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. Henry's face did something complicated. Then why did I place it on your breakfast tray? Caroline finished. Because it arrived with the Morning Post, because it is addressed to you, because it seemed the sort of thing that ought to be brought to your attention promptly. She paused. Was I incorrect? Henry stared at her. Caroline returned to her newspaper. The silence stretched. Finally, Henry said very quietly, How long have you known? Known what? Caroline asked. Her tone was so polite, so genuinely curious, that for a moment Henry looked as though he might believe she was actually asking for clarification. Then he saw her face. About Isabel, he said. Caroline set down the newspaper. She folded it carefully, creasing the edges with the same precision she brought to every task. She set it aside. She looked at her husband across the table that had been set the same way every morning for 7 years, with the same china, the same silver, the same quiet, invisible competence that made his life run without friction. I have known, she said, since the afternoon I walked into the library and saw you with your hand on her waist. Henry's face went white. That was 16 months ago, Caroline said. October, the 14th to be precise. It was a Thursday. I'd come to find a book. She picked up her teacup. The cup did not rattle against the saucer. Her hands were perfectly steady. You were standing by the window. She was laughing. You looked happy. She took a sip of tea. Happier than I had seen you look in some time. Henry sat very still. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. Why did you not say anything? What would you have liked me to say? Caroline asked. She set down her teacup. Would you have liked me to create a scene, to weep, to demand you choose between your wife and your mistress in a manner that would have forced you to make a decision you were not ready to make and resent me for the forcing of it? She folded her hands in her lap. I did not think that would be productive. So you simply, Henry's voice caught, you simply watched? I observed, Caroline corrected gently. There is a difference. Watching implies passivity. I was not passive, Henry. I was waiting. For what? For you to make a mistake large enough that it could not be ignored. She gestured toward the letter. This, for instance. Henry looked at the letter as though it had become something venomous. She should not have written to me here. She knows... He stopped. She knows what? Caroline asked. Her voice was still calm, still polite, but there was something beneath it now, something with edges. She knows that you have a wife, that this house is not a place where she is welcome, that her correspondence arriving at the breakfast table might be inconvenient. Henry flinched. Caroline, You what? She leaned forward slightly. You're sorry? You did not mean for it to happen? She means nothing to you? Caroline's voice was still quiet, but every word landed with precision. Do not insult me by pretending this is something other than what it is. You have been conducting an affair with Isabel Crane for at least 16 months, likely longer. You have taken trips to London to see her. You have missed dinners with me. You have been distracted and distant and entirely elsewhere while I've been here, managing this house, managing the estates, managing every single piece of your life that you have been too occupied to manage yourself. The words hung in the air between them. Henry's jaw worked. He looked like a man who wanted to argue but could not find the ground to stand on. What do you want? He asked finally. His voice was defeated. Caroline looked at him for a long moment. What did she want? The question was larger than Henry understood. She wanted to have married a man who saw her as something more than competent furniture. She wanted to have been chosen for something other than her ability to manage a household and produce heirs, which she had not yet done, a failure that sat between them unspoken but always present. She wanted to have a marriage that felt like partnership rather than a position she held with efficiency and no particular joy. She wanted to be seen. But those wants were too large for this moment, too complicated for this breakfast table, too tangled up in expectations and disappointments that had been accumulating for 7 years. So instead, she said, I want you to listen. Henry nodded slowly. I have listened, Caroline said, to every excuse you have not said aloud, that you are busy, that Parliament demands your time, that the estates are complicated, that I am competent, and do not need your attention the way less capable women need their husbands. I have listened to all of it, Henry, even though you never spoke it, and I have managed accordingly. I have managed the house, I have managed the tenants, I have managed the social calendar and the accounts and the staff and every invisible piece of work that has allowed you to be absent without consequence. I have been the perfect duchess, efficient, capable, undemanding, and you have taken that competence and mistaken it for contentment. She stood. Henry started to rise as well, but she held up a hand and he froze. You will end it with Isabel, Caroline said. Not because I am demanding it out of wounded pride or jealousy, but because I will not be married to a man who is conducting his life in 2 separate households. You will write to her today. You will be kind, you will be clear, and you will be final. Caroline. I am not finished. Her voice was still quiet, but it carried now in a way that made Henry close his mouth. You will also understand that the version of this marriage where I manage everything while you are elsewhere and distracted is over. If you wish to remain married to me, and I assure you, Henry, that continuing this marriage is a choice you are making, not an inevitability, then you will be present. You will dine with me more than twice a week. You will ask about my day and listen to the answer. You will stop treating this house as a hotel where everything is maintained for your comfort and start treating it as a home that we share. She picked up the letter from beside his plate. She held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, and then she handed it back to him. And you will not make me manage your indiscretions again. Because the next time a letter like this arrives, I will not place it on your breakfast tray. I will place it in the hands of a solicitor, and we will have a very different conversation about the future of this marriage. She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame, and looked back at him. I have been patient, Henry. I have been competent. I have been everything you needed me to be while asking for nothing in return. But my patience is not infinite, and my competence does not equal my consent to be ignored. She left. Henry sat alone at the breakfast table with the letter in his hands and the cold remains of his coffee and the growing, uncomfortable understanding that he had been living in a house run by a woman he had consistently underestimated. 3 weeks later, Henry was still in residence at Thornfield. He had not returned to London except for a single day to attend a critical vote in Parliament, and he had returned that same evening. He had written to Isabel. Caroline did not know what the letter said. She had not asked, and he had not offered, but Isabel had stopped attending the same social events, and the trips to London had ceased entirely. Henry began dining with Caroline every evening. At first, the dinners were awkward, filled with silences that neither of them knew how to fill. But slowly, gradually, they began to talk. Not about Isabel, not about the affair. Those topics remained unspoken, filed away in the category of things that had happened and could not be undone, but did not need to be continually revisited. Instead, they talked about the estate, about the tenants, about the new irrigation system the steward was proposing for the southern fields, about the school Caroline had been trying to establish for the tenants' children and the resistance she was facing from some of the older families who believed education was wasted on farm girls. Henry listened. He asked questions. He offered suggestions. And one evening, over dessert, he said, "I should have asked you about this years ago." Caroline looked up from her syllabub. "Asked me about what?" "About what you do," Henry said. "How you manage all of it. I've spent 7 years assuming that everything simply happened because you were competent, and I never stopped to consider that competence is not the same as ease, that the work you do to make this house run is actual work." He set down his spoon. "I took you for granted, Caroline. I took all of this for granted, and I'm sorry." It was not a grand apology. It was not accompanied by flowers or jewels or dramatic gestures. It was simply a man sitting across a dinner table from his wife and admitting, with visible discomfort, that he had failed her. Caroline considered it. She considered whether the apology was enough, whether 3 weeks of dinners and attention could balance against 16 months of betrayal and 5 years of benign neglect. She considered whether she wanted to forgive him, whether forgiveness was even the right framework for what she was feeling, which was not anger anymore, but something more complicated. Something that felt like grief for the marriage they had not built and cautious, tentative hope for the marriage they might. "Thank you," she said finally, "for saying that." Henry nodded. They finished their syllabub in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than the ones that had filled their dinners for years. It was not the silence of two people with nothing to say. It was the silence of two people learning, slowly and imperfectly, how to say things that mattered. 6 months after the letter arrived, Caroline was in the garden overseeing the autumn planting when Henry found her. He was carrying something wrapped in brown paper, and he had the expression of a man who was about to do something that made him nervous. "I brought you something," he said. Caroline straightened, brushing dirt from her hands. "Oh?" He handed her the package. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a book, not a novel, not the kind of decorative volume that was gifted to wives as a gesture toward their presumed interest in improving literature. It was a technical manual on estate management and agricultural reform, recently published, the kind of book that was sold to stewards and landowners, not to duchesses. "I saw it in London," Henry said. "The bookseller said it was the most current thinking on crop rotation and soil management. I thought—" He stopped, started again. "You mentioned last month that you were trying to convince the tenants to try a new planting schedule. I thought this might be useful." Caroline looked at the book. She looked at her husband, who had remembered a conversation they had had over dinner 4 weeks ago about crop yields, and had gone to a bookshop in London and purchased something he thought would help her do work that he had, for years, not acknowledged she was doing. It was not a grand gesture, but it was a gesture. And it was, she thought, perhaps the beginning of something. "Thank you," she said. "This is exactly what I needed." Henry's face did something that might have been relief. "I've also been thinking," he said carefully, "about the school, the one you wanted to establish for the tenants' children. I spoke with the steward. We can convert the old grain store on the east side of the estate. It needs some repair, but the structure is sound. If you still want to pursue it, I would like to help." Caroline looked at him. 7 years of marriage, 5 years of benign neglect, 16 months of betrayal, 3 weeks of a letter on a breakfast tray, and the slow, difficult work of rebuilding something that had been broken from the beginning because it had never been properly built. "I would like that," she said. The work on the school began in November. Caroline and Henry walked the property together, assessing what repairs were needed, discussing where the desks should be placed to catch the best light, debating whether they should hire one teacher or two. Henry listened to her ideas with an attention that was new, or perhaps not new, but newly deployed. He took notes. He asked the steward to prioritize the repairs. And when the first group of tenant children arrived in January for the opening day of term, Henry stood beside Caroline at the entrance and greeted each family personally, learning their names, asking about their farms, demonstrating with every interaction that this school was not simply his wife's project, but something he supported completely. The tenants noticed. More importantly, they trusted it. By spring, enrollment had doubled. The transformation was not immediate, and it was not without setbacks. There were evenings when Henry fell back into old patterns, when he stayed late at his club or became absorbed in parliamentary business, and forgot to send word that he would miss dinner. There were mornings when Caroline felt the old familiar loneliness creeping back, the sense that she was managing a household alone while her husband was elsewhere. But the difference now was that when these things happened, they talked about it. Henry would apologize. Caroline would explain, clearly and without accusation, how his absence had affected her, and they would both make adjustments. It was not passion. It was not the kind of romance that poets wrote about or that novelists described with breathless intensity. But it was partnership. It was two people learning, slowly and with considerable effort, to build something that resembled a marriage instead of a well-managed estate with two polite strangers living in it. One evening in late April, nearly a year after the letter had arrived, Caroline was reading in the library when Henry entered. He had been in London for 2 days, attending to parliamentary matters, and she had not expected him back until the following morning. "You're home early," she said, setting down her book. "I finished what needed doing," he said. He crossed the room and sat in the chair opposite hers, which was something he had started doing in recent months, sitting with her in the evenings instead of retreating to his study or his club. "I also realized something while I was there." "What was that?" "That I did not want to be in London," he said. "I wanted to be here." He paused. "With you." Caroline looked at him. A year ago, such a statement would have felt like a performance, something said because it was expected rather than because it was true. But now, looking at his face in the firelight, she saw that he meant it, not with grand romantic conviction, but with the steady, quiet certainty of a man who had finally figured out where he belonged. "I am glad you came home," she said, and she meant it. They sat together in the library, reading their respective books, speaking occasionally about small things, a passage that had interested one of them, a question about the next day's schedule, a comment about the weather. It was profoundly ordinary. It was also, Caroline thought, the most content she had felt in 7 years of marriage. The letter from Isabel never came up again. It sat, metaphorically, in the same category as Henry's trips to London and the 5 years of benign neglect, things that had happened that had damaged them both, but that did not need to be continually revisited in order to move forward. Forgiveness, Caroline had learned, was not a single grand gesture. It was a series of small decisions, made daily, to choose repair over resentment. They stood in the garden as the autumn light fell long across the fields, and the silence between them was not empty, but full of work still to be done, full of conversations still to have, full of the slow and imperfect process of two people learning to see each other not as roles to be performed, but as people to be known. The marriage of Caroline and Henry Ashford would never be a romance. It had not started as one, and the damage of the middle years could not be undone by dinners and apologies and thoughtful books about crop rotation. But it was, Caroline thought, as she turned the pages of the manual and Henry stood beside her, pointing out a passage he thought she would find interesting, becoming something real, something built on attention and effort and the deliberate choice to stay and to try. And that morning, a year and 3 months after the letter had arrived, Caroline came down to breakfast and found Henry already at the table. He had poured her tea, he had unfolded her newspaper, and he looked up when she entered with a smile that was small and genuine and entirely present. Good morning, he said. Good morning, she said. She sat down. She picked up her teacup. The eggs were perfect, as they always were, because the household ran with the same invisible competence it always had. But the difference now was that Henry noticed. He noticed the eggs. He noticed the tea. He noticed the thousand small daily acts of work that made his life comfortable. And he thanked her for them. It was not perfect. But it was no longer adequate. It was becoming, slowly and with considerable work still ahead, something close to good. And for Caroline Ashford, who had spent 7 years managing a marriage with competence and no particular joy, good was more than she had expected. It was, she was beginning to understand, enough.